Hello everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Holly Phelps and I'm a teacher at Beaulieu Park Primary, and this year I'm leading the think tank around memory and metacognition. Thank you to all the schools who've already welcomed me and allowed me to gain an insight into the amazing things we do, and I look forward to the rest of our visits. By the end of this project, I'm hoping to have created a CPD toolkit that can be accessed by all, but today I'm going to share some of the research and evidence gathered so far. Today we'll be focusing on metacognition. We know some schools have already been working on this area, but I hope there'll be something for everyone today. What you hear today could be new to you, or it may help you tweak your current practice, or just get you using some of the strategies more consistently. My hope is we can all use what we talk about today more deliberately and more consistently in our practice. The reasoning behind today's session is the extensive evidence base, here summarised by the EEF. Their summary suggests that teaching children metacognitive strategies is high impact and low cost. We feel the strategies today can be used to have a particular impact on those pupils who are on the cusp of not meeting their academic targets. Today's training is in line with recommendations set out by the Education Endowment Fund, particularly Recommendation 7, which says that schools should support teachers to develop their knowledge of metacognition and self-regulation. So what is a self-regulated learner? The EEF defines self-regulation as the extent to which learners are aware of their strengths, aware of their weaknesses, and aware of the strategies they use to learn. It describes how they can motivate themselves, how they engage in their learning, and how they develop strategies to improve. It will look different for learners of different ages, for different tasks, but teachers will recognise these characteristics in their most effective learners. Please pause the video here for discussion. Think about a class you teach. Can you identify self-regulated learners in your class? How many are there? If you can't recognise them, what could you do to make yourself more aware? It's important to point out here that some learners who are quiet may meet some of the criteria, but may not necessarily be self-regulated learners. Self-regulated learning can be broken into three essential components. First, you have cognition. Cognition is the mental processes involved in knowing, understanding and learning. This is the bread and butter of teaching, the things that we are teaching them, that knowledge, the things we want them to remember. Then we have metacognition, often defined as thinking about thinking, but it's also so much more than that, which we'll see as we continue. And finally, we have motivation. That's our willingness to engage and use our metacognitive and cognitive skills and apply them to our learning. You need to know about these to help pupils to develop into successful learners. So what is metacognition? The EEF defines metacognition as the ways learners monitor and purposefully direct their learning. Please pause this video here to watch the clip from the EEF that explains metacognition further. To summarise the video, metacognition includes both our metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation. Our metacognitive knowledge includes our knowledge of the task, our knowledge of strategies and of ourselves, whereas metacognitive regulation refers to how we apply this knowledge. This is broken into three stages which we're going to look at further. This diagram represents the metacognitive regulation cycle. It's not a one-off process of discrete steps, but an ongoing cycle. The EEF recommends that teachers consider this cycle when setting learning tasks and supporting pupils to complete them. In an expert learner, like us, these processes are unconscious and automatic. In novice learners, however, it can be valuable to make them explicit. Let's look at how the three stages of metacognitive regulation can look in a real-world scenario. In the middle here, you'll see an example of a maths problem. So a child encounters a maths problem. First, they plan how they'll begin. Here they have to access their metacognitive knowledge. Then as they begin to carry out the task, they'll be using their cognitive knowledge. They'll be pulling from their memory their knowledge of how to write an algebraic equation. As they are working through, they will be monitoring themselves, monitoring how well the strategy is working. They then would evaluate their success. It's important to note that metacognition is not something to be taught discreetly, but something that's taught alongside the content of the lesson. We are doing these three steps all the time. Your self-regulated learners you identified earlier will be carrying out the three steps. But as we mentioned earlier, for the expert learner, these processes are automatic and unconscious. How do we make the processes explicit to support those we teach? One recommendation from the EEF is to follow this 7-step model. Many of these aspects will be familiar to you, but at each stage there are opportunities to teach metacognition. The colours in the diagram show the shift of responsibility from the teacher to the pupil. Here we see examples of what may happen at each stage of the model. Please pause the video here so you can read them. This seems like the perfect time to stop and share some examples of evidence I've gathered while visiting schools in our trust. The 7-step model begins by activating our students' prior knowledge. I'm going to share with you some examples from different schools of how they activate prior knowledge. This is an example from Lakelands Primary School. This is an example slide from one of their lessons. At Lakelands Primary, they remind children of what they've already learned in previous lessons, topics and years. And they do this by reminding them of what they already know. So they bring up a slide like this. What do you already know that will help you this lesson? This here comes from Perryfields Infant School. Perryfields Infant School use retrieval quizzes at the beginning of their lessons. The questions they choose will be relevant to that lesson and allow children's prior knowledge to be activated. But they also use these animals to help the children recognise when that learning comes from and where in their memory they might find it. In the primary at Beauty Park, we begin our lessons with a retrieval quiz. We call it Remember, Recap, Review. The questions we choose will link to the lesson coming up. It will allow them to activate prior knowledge that will help them for their learning going further. Here we have an example from the Beauty Park Secondary. This shows how we can use a low-stakes quiz to activate some prior knowledge ready for the upcoming lesson. How do you ensure activation of prior knowledge? How do you make it explicit that this knowledge is relevant to the lesson you're about to teach? Pause the video here to discuss and for your facilitator to gather your best ways of activating prior knowledge. Let's look back at our 7-step model. Now earlier we spoke about how we need to make our unconscious and automatic processes explicit. I think there's one step that's particularly helpful for allowing us to do that, and that's the step of modelling. On the screen here you'll see another guideline from the EEF. This states that we should verbalise our metacognitive thinking whilst modelling to children. Asking yourself questions and using phrases depicted above during live modelling will allow our automatic and unconscious processes to become explicit for our students. This links to our ACE framework, particularly the Engage section, which refers to improving engagement through our modelling. Pause the video here to read the sections. Do you do this whilst you live model? Do you do it deliberately? Do you do it consistently? We're now going to look at an example of this in action. The EEF explains how you may model the process of planning, monitoring and evaluation using think alouds whilst you're doing your live modelling with the children. This is in the context of an art lesson, so as you model how to draw a self-portrait in art. So you'd begin with those planning questions. You'd ask these questions to yourself in front of the children whilst modelling and answer them. This allows children to gain access to our metacognitive regulation in action. You may begin with the planning questions, but then as you start to live model, use the monitoring type questions on yourself and the evaluation questions. Now I want to think about how we're going to apply some of the things we've talked about today. What I would like you to think about is an upcoming lesson. Could you plan your think alouds for an upcoming lesson where you will live model? What questions could you ask yourself in your think alouds that will allow your metacognitive processes to become explicit to your children? How you make those processes of planning, monitoring and evaluating explicit. During the teaching this lesson, keep an eye on those particular children. What is the impact of your deliberate and consistent think alouds on their progress? Thank you for listening to me today and engaging in today's CPD. I hope you found something you could take away. We know a lot of you are using some of the things we spoke about already, but we want everyone to be using it consistently and deliberately. We know this will have an impact on those learners, especially those ones who may feel on the cusp of achieving their academic expectations. If you would like to read more around the area, I have shared a link to the EEF page that will give you a more detailed guidance document, as well as other useful visuals and examples and documents. Thank you again for your time.